A convoy of military trucks stretched across the horizon, hauling a portable bridge worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The steel beams glinted under the Montana sun as the vehicles rolled toward Ashwind Flats, a stretch of open prairie in Copperloe County. Then the convoy stopped. Ahead, the grassland had turned into a living wall. Nearly 3,000 American bison moved across the plain in a single mass, their hooves stirring a haze of dust into the sky. The herd stretched from one horizon to the other, a river of dark fur and horns that no engineer had planned for. A drone lifted off the lead truck, its rotors slicing the silence. A loudspeaker crackled to life, blasting a high-pitched warning tone across the flats. The herd did not part. It tightened. Bison at the edges broke into a run, pressing inward, crowding toward a rocky ridge on the far side of the field. Dust rose thicker. Hooves pounded the earth in a rhythm that made the ground tremble beneath the trucks. Captain Marcus Reyes stood at the front of the convoy, radio in hand, watching thousands of tons of muscle and horn spiral toward panic. That was when the sound reached them. A low mechanical growl, steady and unhurried, rolling in from the west. Heads turned. Crawling over a ridge came a machine that belonged in a museum, not a war zone. A Caterpillar 60, built in 1932, its paint long faded to rust and gray, its tracks grinding slow and even against the dirt. Behind the wheel sat an old man. 84 years old, according to the paperwork nobody had bothered to check. He brought the machine to a stop beside the convoy and climbed down without a word. Reyes let out a short laugh, more disbelief than humor. "You planning to teach the army how to herd cattle, old man?" The farmer didn't blink. He looked past the captain, out toward the herd, reading something in the dust and the light that no one else in that convoy could see. "Turn everything off," he said. "Then let me work." The radio in Reyes's hand kept crackling with updates from the rear vehicles, but for a moment, nobody spoke. An 84-year-old man in a canvas jacket had just given an order to a captain of the United States Army, and the strangest part was that nobody laughed twice. There's a reason stories like this one pull at something deep in us. Most of us grew up watching someone older, a grandfather, a neighbor, a farmer down the road, who never raised his voice, never needed a screen to tell him what was happening in the world around him. They read the wind, they read the animals, they read silence itself. And in a world now run by drones and notifications, there's a quiet ache in remembering that kind of knowledge ever existed. If stories like that mean something to you, if you find yourself missing a slower world, one where people still trusted their own eyes over a screen, this is exactly why we make these videos. Stay with us to the end, because what this old farmer does next isn't just clever. It's the kind of thing that makes you believe some knowledge never goes out of style. Hit subscribe now, so you don't lose this channel in the noise, because we bring you one story like this every single week, and trust me, you won't want to miss the next one. Back at Ashwind Flats, the dust hadn't settled. Reyes turned to his engineers, waiting for someone to explain what a rusted machine from 1932 could possibly do that a drone and a loudspeaker system worth more than most houses could not. 3 hours earlier, the plan had looked simple on paper. The bridge convoy needed to cross Ashwind Flats before nightfall, and the migration route cutting through it was, according to every satellite map the engineers had pulled up, empty. Nobody at command had accounted for bison timing their crossing to the same afternoon. Nobody had thought to check. The lead engineer, a young lieutenant named Foster, had tried the textbook approach first. Drones were sent up in a wide formation, meant to create a visual barrier that would nudge the herd sideways. The bison didn't nudge. They scattered into tighter clusters, the panic rippling outward like a stone dropped in water. Next came sound. Speakers mounted on 2 trucks blasted frequencies designed to disperse wildlife without harming it. The herd's reaction was immediate and wrong. Instead of drifting away from the noise, they pressed toward each other, bodies packed so close that some began stumbling over uneven ground. Foster's third idea was the one that made Reyes step in personally. Two armored vehicles began creeping forward, angling to cut across the herd's path and force a redirection. It was the kind of maneuver that worked on paper, in a simulation, on a whiteboard back at base. Out here, it meant thousands of animals suddenly facing a wall of steel where open plain used to be. The herd didn't turn, it surged. For a moment, the front line of bison broke into a run toward a rocky ridge at the edge of the flats, a dead end, as far as anyone could tell from the maps. Reyes watched through binoculars as the dust thickened, swallowing the front runners whole. Somewhere in that cloud, nearly 3,000 animals were making a decision under pressure, and nothing in the Army's playbook accounted for what a frightened herd might do next. "Pull the drones back," Reyes finally ordered, his voice flatter than he intended. "Kill the speakers." Foster hesitated. "Sir, if we stop now, we lose daylight. The bridge components can't sit exposed overnight. The specs say—" "I'm aware of the specs, Lieutenant." Reyes lowered the binoculars. He didn't have another plan. That was the part he wasn't going to say out loud in front of 30 soldiers and a convoy worth more than most towns in Copperlow County put together. It was in that silence, that particular kind of silence that settles over people who have run out of ideas, that the sound of an old diesel engine first reached them from the west. Walton Greer had lived in Bitterstone for 84 years, though most of the county had stopped counting his age the way they counted anyone else's. He was simply the man who had always been there, the last person left who remembered Ashwind Flats before the fences, before the surveyors, before anyone thought to draw lines across land that had never asked for them. He didn't walk toward the trucks. He walked toward the herd. Reyes fell into step beside him, more out of confusion than agreement. "You've done this before?" "Watched my father do it," Greer said. "Watched his father do it before that." He stopped at a small rise overlooking the flats and lifted an old pair of binoculars, the leather strap cracked with age. He wasn't looking at the bison themselves. He was looking at the ground beneath them, the long shadows the herd cast across the grass, the way those shadows bent and shifted as thousands of animals moved as one. "They're not panicking because they're scared," he said finally. "They're panicking because everything you've thrown at them is coming from the wrong direction." Foster, standing a few steps back, frowned. "We approached from 3 sides to funnel them." "You didn't funnel them. You surrounded them." Greer lowered the binoculars. "An animal that size doesn't think about where it's going. It thinks about what's behind it. You put pressure on all sides. It doesn't pick a direction. It just runs from all of you at once." Nobody argued. Nobody had a counterpoint that had worked in the last 3 hours. Greer turned toward the ridge where the herd had gathered, tight and trembling, dust hanging in a slow curtain above them. He studied the wind for a long moment, feeling it against the side of his face rather than checking any instrument for it. "I need everything off," he said. "The drones, the speakers, the radios, if you can manage it." Reyes crossed his arms. "That herd is one bad move away from a stampede, and you want us to go dark?" "That herd is one bad move away from a stampede because you keep making bad moves." Greer's voice never rose. It didn't need to. "Give them quiet, and they'll tell you exactly where they want to go. You just have to stop shouting long enough to listen." For a long moment the captain said nothing. Behind him, 30 soldiers waited on a decision that would either save the day or hand it entirely to a man old enough to be their grandfather's grandfather. Reyes keyed his radio. "All units, power down, drones grounded, full quiet." The silence that followed felt different from the one before it. This one had a purpose. With the machines silent, Greer walked back to Old Bess, the nickname stitched in faded thread on a strap hanging from the seat. The Caterpillar 60 had belonged to his father, then to him, kept running through 9 decades on nothing but stubbornness and parts he'd learned to machine himself when factories stopped making them. He climbed up, settled into the worn seat, and looked out at the herd one more time before starting the engine. "You're not gonna push them," he said, mostly to himself. "You're gonna walk beside them." The tractor rolled forward at a pace that made the young soldiers exchange glances. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. It simply moved, steady and unbothered, angling toward the eastern edge of the herd rather than anywhere near its center. Reyes watched through his binoculars, arms crossed, waiting for the moment this would fall apart. It didn't. The bison nearest the tractor shifted their weight, ears turning toward the sound, but none of them bolted. The engine's low growl was nothing like the drone's whine or the speaker's blast. It was steady, familiar almost, the kind of sound that didn't threaten because it never changed. Greer kept Old Bess moving parallel to the herd's flank, close enough to be noticed, far enough to never feel like a wall closing in. "He's not cutting them off," Foster said quietly, almost to himself. "He's just suggesting." That was exactly it. Greer wasn't forcing a direction. He was offering one, patient enough to let nearly 3,000 animals decide it was their own idea. Slowly, the front of the herd began to bend. Not away from the tractor, but alongside it, the bison at the leading edge angling their path a few degrees south, toward open ground that curved gently around the rocky ridge instead of slamming straight into it. Reyes lowered his binoculars, disbelief written plainly across his face. Behind him, he heard Foster mutter something about redoing every field manual the division owned. "Convoy," Reyes said into his radio, his voice quieter than before. "Follow the tractor's line, match his speed. Nobody moves ahead of him." For the first time in 3 hours, 30 soldiers, a fleet of military vehicles worth more than most towns in Montana, and a bridge components shipment critical to a federal timeline fell into formation behind an 84-year-old man on a tractor built before any of their grandparents were born. Nobody questioned it. Nobody dared. Greer didn't look back to see if they were following. He already knew they would be. He'd spent 84 years learning that the herd, any herd, animal or otherwise, moved best when it stopped being told where to go and started being shown. The convoy held its line for nearly 2 miles, the tractor's steady pace setting the rhythm for everything behind it. The herd moved alongside them now, no longer pressing or scattering, simply migrating the way it had for longer than anyone in that convoy had been alive. It was near the halfway point that the ground began to change. The lead scout vehicle, one of 2 armored trucks that had tried to cut across the herd earlier, hit a stretch of earth that looked no different from anything around it. The front wheels sank first, slow and quiet, the truck tilting forward as the ground beneath it gave way like wet sand pretending to be solid. The second truck, following close behind, swerved to avoid the first, and found the same fate waiting a few yards over. Radios lit up with confusion, engines revved uselessly, tires spinning deeper into ground that had looked, on every satellite image the Army owned, like flat and stable prairie. Greer brought Old Bess to a stop and looked back at the scene with the same unhurried calm he'd shown all afternoon. "Hidden Spring," he said, almost to himself. "Runs under this whole stretch. Ground looks solid till it isn't." Reyes was already moving toward the sinking vehicles, barking orders that weren't accomplishing much. Winches were deployed. Cables were attached. The truck's own engines only dug them deeper, the way panic always did. Greer turned the tractor around. He backed Old Bess up, but not directly in front of the trapped truck. He angled the tractor toward a subtle rise of lighter dirt, a hidden vein of solid bedrock just beneath the surface that only someone who had walked this land for decades would know was there. He didn't try to outmuscle a modern armored vehicle with an old tractor. Instead, He climbed down and pulled a massive, heavy-duty snatch block from his toolbox. He walked through the mud, hooked it to the Caterpillar's heavy steel drawbar, and pointed to the modern winch on the front of the sunken truck. "Run your cable through my block, hook it back to your own bumper, and turn your wheels 10 degrees left," he told the bewildered driver. It wasn't brute force. It was leverage, geometry, and knowing the ground. With the heavy tractor acting as an immovable anchor on solid rock, the truck's own winch doubled its pulling power. The modern engine strained, the cables snapped taut, and then the vehicle began to move, slow, steady, easing out of the soft ground like a tooth pulled from a socket. The second truck came free the same way minutes later. It was a perfect marriage of modern machinery and century-old wisdom, guided by a man who understood how to work with the earth instead of fighting it. Reyes stood at the edge of the recovered vehicles, mud streaked up to his knees, staring at old Bess as if seeing it for the first time. "How did you know that ground wouldn't hold?" Greer climbed down, wiping his hands on a rag from his back pocket. "Same way the herd knew." He nodded toward the Bison, still moving steadily along the route they'd chosen, a route that curved noticeably around the exact stretch of ground that had swallowed 2 armored trucks whole. Foster, kneeling beside a laptop showing the convoy's satellite terrain map, went quiet. He zoomed in, then zoomed in again. Nothing on the map indicated soft ground. No warning, no flag, no data point suggesting danger. "Sir," he said slowly, "the herd didn't cross this section at all. They went around it, every single one of them." Reyes looked out at nearly 3,000 animals moving in an unbroken line, none of them anywhere near the ground that had trapped 2 of the Army's most advanced vehicles. "They didn't need a map," Greer said, climbing back onto his tractor. "They needed quiet enough to feel the ground shift under them before it gave way." By the time the herd cleared the far ridge of Ashwind Flats, the sun had dropped low enough to turn the dust gold instead of gray. The convoy rolled to a stop on solid ground, bridge components intact, vehicles recovered, not a single animal lost, and not a single soldier hurt. Reyes walked toward Old Bess as Greer climbed down for what felt like the 100th time that day, though his legs never seemed to tire the way everyone else's had. The captain extended a hand. It wasn't a gesture he made lightly, and everyone standing nearby seemed to understand that. "3 hours ago, I asked if you were planning to teach the Army how to herd cattle. You did." "I was wrong to laugh." Greer shook his hand, brief and firm, the kind of handshake that didn't need to prove anything. "Wasn't cattle. Different animal. Different lesson." Reyes let out something close to a laugh, this time without the edge it had carried that morning. Around them, soldiers who had spent 3 hours watching drones fail and speakers fail and armored trucks sink into hidden ground now watched an 84-year-old farmer climb back onto a tractor built in 1932 like it was any other Tuesday. "We could use someone like you," Reyes said, "consulting, officially even. The Army pays well for expertise." Greer considered this for a moment, the way a man considers an offer he's already decided against but wants to be polite about. "I've got cattle to feed," he said, "and I don't imagine the Army needs to keep an old man on payroll. You've got the lesson now. That's worth more than a paycheck." "What lesson is that?" Greer looked out at the herd disappearing over the horizon, nearly 3,000 animals moving on, indifferent to the trucks and the drones and the men who had spent a morning trying to outthink something that had never needed their help. "Stop trying to control what you don't understand," he said. "Watch it long enough, and it'll show you exactly where to go." Reyes turned to Foster, who was still staring at his laptop, at a satellite map that had failed to predict soft ground, hidden water, and the exact migration path nearly 3,000 bison would choose to keep themselves safe. "Lieutenant, new protocol, effective immediately. Every convoy route through this state gets cross-checked against wildlife migration data before movement. No exceptions." Foster nodded, already typing. Greer didn't wait around for thanks he hadn't asked for. He climbed onto Old Bess, started the engine with the same low growl that had first turned every head in that convoy hours earlier, and pointed the tractor back toward Bitterstone. He didn't look back. He never did. Some men measure a day by what they gained from it. Greer measured his by whether the herd made it home safe, and today it had. There's a version of this story that ends with medals, or headlines, or Walton Greer sitting across from some general accepting an award nobody in Bitterstone would ever hear about. That's not what happened. What happened is smaller and somehow bigger at the same time. He drove Old Bess back through Copperloe County as the sky turned deep orange behind him, past the same fences his father built, past the same stretch of road he'd walked to school on decades before the Army ever thought to build a bridge across Ashwind Flats. He didn't tell anyone in town what happened that day. Someone from the convoy must have, because by the following week, folks in Bitterstone were shaking his hand at the feed store like he'd done something remarkable. To him, he hadn't. He'd just paid attention. That's the part of this story that's easy to miss underneath the trucks and the drones and the mud-soaked soldiers. The lesson wasn't really about bison or tractors or hidden ground. It was about the difference between forcing your way through a problem and taking the time to understand it first. Nearly 3,000 animals didn't need to be controlled. They needed someone patient enough to listen to what they already knew. Maybe that's why stories like this stay with us. Somewhere out there, in towns nobody drives through anymore, there are people like Walton Greer, quiet, unhurried, holding on to knowledge that doesn't show up on any satellite map. People who were never in a rush to prove anything because they already knew what mattered. If this story reminded you of someone like that, a grandfather, a neighbor, someone who taught you to slow down and actually look at the world instead of fighting it, leave their name in the comments below. Let them be remembered, even if it's just here. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about quiet people who understood something the rest of the world forgot, subscribe now. Because the world moves fast, and it's easy to lose the stories that remind us to slow down. We don't want you to miss the next one.